Dairy is once again at the center of Canada-U.S. trade tension. The U.S. says Canada isn't living up to the spirit of the agreement when it comes to dairy imports, while Canada insists this current system is essential to protect our dairy farmers.
To ensure long-term certainty of the Canada-U.S.-Mexico trade agreement, the United States is calling for sweeping changes within the dairy market.
A major trade dispute is taking shape between the United States and Canada, and this one is different from the usual back-and-forth negotiations. In most trade conflicts, countries argue, pressure each other, and eventually reach some form of compromise. This time, however, Canada is in a position where it cannot simply agree to the demands being made. Even if it wanted to, the reason is not strategy or stubbornness, but a law passed in 2025 that legally blocks certain concessions. As a key deadline approaches, tensions are rising. And the outcome could reshape economic and political relations in ways that are not immediately obvious. At the center of the conflict is the long-standing issue of Canada's dairy market. The United States has been pushing for greater access for its dairy producers, arguing that current restrictions are unfair and limit trade opportunities. This would lead to intense negotiations with both sides trying to find middle ground. But Canada's position is now constrained by legislation that removes flexibility entirely. The government is not just unwilling to concede, it is unable to do so under current law. This creates an unusual situation in international trade. One side is making strong demands, expecting negotiation and compromise, while the other side is effectively pointing to its legal framework and saying that the requested changes are not possible. This transforms what would typically be a bargaining process into something much more rigid and potentially more volatile. The importance of this dispute becomes clearer. When looking at the scale of Canada's dairy industry, it is not a small or easily adjustable sector. It represents a massive economic engine generating billions of dollars annually and supporting hundreds of thousands of jobs. And truth is reckoned on it, particularly in provinces like Quebec and Ontario, where dairy farming is deeply embedded in both the economy and local identity. In Quebec alone, dairy farming is a major pillar of rural life. Thousands of farms and processing facilities operate across the province, forming a network that supports communities and contributes significantly to the national economy, because Quebec also holds substantial political influence at the federal level. Any issue affecting its core industries quickly becomes a national political matter. This means that decisions about dairy policy are never just economic, they are also electoral and cultural. The system that protects this industry is known as supply management, that has been in place since the 1970s and is designed to stabilize the market for farmers. It works through three main components. First, production quotas limit how much each farm can produce, preventing oversupply. Second, price controls ensure that farmers receive a stable, predictable income. Third, high import tariffs restrict foreign competition, making it difficult for outside producers to enter the Canadian market. These tariffs are not minor barriers. They are set at levels that effectively block large-scale imports. The goal is not to slightly disadvantage foreign products, but to maintain a controlled domestic system that prioritizes Canadian producers. For decades, this approach has provided stability for farmers, but has also been a point of contention in trade discussions, especially with the United States. Where dairy production operates on a much larger scale, American producers have long argued that Canada's system is unfair and limits their ability to compete. During earlier trade negotiations, the United States secured a small opening in the Canadian market, which was seen as a breakthrough at the time. However, the actual impact of that access turned out to be minimal. While the agreement technically allowed American products into Canada, the way the system was implemented meant that very little additional trade actually occurred. The core issue lies in how access quotas were distributed. Instead of going to companies most likely to import foreign dairy products, they were largely assigned to domestic processors. These companies already rely heavily on Canadian milk, giving them little incentive to bring in American alternatives. As a result, the market opening existed more on paper than in reality. From the American perspective, this was seen as a clever workaround, technically compliant with the agreement, but undermining its intended purpose. This frustration has been building for years and has now reached a critical point. U.S. officials and industry groups have become increasingly vocal, arguing that Canada's approach is unfair and needs to change. Political pressure has grown, with lawmakers and industry leaders calling for stronger action to ensure meaningful access to the Canadian market. The situation changed dramatically. With the passage of a new Canadian law in 2025, this legislation effectively locks in the existing system by prohibiting the government from making certain concessions in future trade negotiations. Specifically, it prevents any increase in import quotas or reduction in tariffs for key agricultural sectors, including dairy. This means that even if Canadian leaders wanted to offer greater access as part of a broader trade deal, they would be unable to do so without first changing the law. And changing the law is no simple matter. It would require political support. That is unlikely to materialize given the importance of the dairy sector to key voting regions. For Canadian policymakers, this law serves a dual purpose. Domestically, it reassures farmers and industry stakeholders that their interests are protected. Internationally, that provides a clear and firm position in negotiations. Instead of debating the merits of different proposals, Canadian officials can point to the legal framework and state that certain options are simply off the table. This shifts the dynamics of negotiations significantly. It removes ambiguity and limits the range of possible outcomes. While this might strengthen Canada's position in some ways, it also increases the risk of a deadlock when one side cannot move. The burden shifts to the other side to decide how far it is willing to push the issue. Political realities within Canada reinforce this rigidity. Dairy farmers are highly organized and politically active, particularly in regions that play a decisive role in federal elections. Any attempt to weaken the supply management system would likely trigger strong opposition, not only from farmers, but also from the broader public in affected areas. For politicians, the risks of making concessions are substantial and immediate. Even small changes can be perceived as significant threats. For example, adjusting how import quotas are allocated might seem like a technical fix, but it could be interpreted as the first step toward dismantling the entire system. In this environment, perception matters as much as policy, and even minor compromises can carry major political consequences. At the same time, Canada has been working to reduce its reliance on the United States as a trading partner. Efforts to diversify trade relationships have gained momentum with new agreements and partnerships being explored and developed. This broader strategy provides Canada with additional leverage as it reduces the pressure to accommodate U.S. demands. By expanding trade with other countries and regions, Canada is signaling that it has alternatives. This does not eliminate the importance of its relationship with the United States, but it does change the balance of power in negotiations. The message is clear. Canada is not entirely dependent on a single partner and can pursue other opportunities if necessary. On the American side, the situation is more complicated than it might appear. While dairy producers are pushing for stronger action, other industries have a different perspective. Many sectors rely heavily on stable trade relations with Canada and benefit from existing agreements. Disrupting those arrangements over a single issue could have widespread consequences. Industries such as manufacturing, energy, and automotive production are deeply integrated across the US-Canada border. Supply chains often span both countries, making it difficult to separate them without significant cost and disruption. For these sectors, maintaining a stable trade framework is a top priority. This creates a difficult balancing act for US leadership. On one hand, there is pressure to support domestic dairy producers and address their concerns. On the other hand, there is a need to protect broader economic interests that depend on smooth cross-border trade. Escalating the dispute could satisfy one group while harming many others. As the deadline approaches, both sides are facing tough choices. Canada is standing firm, backed by legal constraints and domestic political realities. The United States must decide how far it is willing to go in pushing for changes that may not be achievable under the current framework. Ultimately, the question is not just about dairy. It is about how countries navigate conflicts when traditional negotiation tools are limited or unavailable. It is about the balance between domestic policy and international commitments, and it is about how economic and political pressures shape decisions at the highest levels.